Joe Arpaio declaring the sex crime cases his department bungled now virtually closed.
We resolved this in 2007. I wish somebody would get that straight.
Nearly 5 years later, Sheriff Arpaio still has not revealed why more than 400 sex abuse cases were not investigated, including dozens in El Mirage. But now we may have some answers. The new book is titled If There Were Victims, and it's written by the former El Mirage Assistant Chief who reviewed dozens of sex crime cases that were reported but never investigated by the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. The author is Bill Lewis, a former deputy chief in Phoenix who led the baseline killer and serial shooter investigations. Welcome to Sunday Square, officer.
Thank you.
I want you to tell us why you chose the title for the book, because I think it explains why you wrote the book.
It does. Back on December 5th, when Sheriff Arpaio had a press conference to address this issue about the mishandled sex crime cases, he made a half-hearted apology to the victims by questioning if, in fact, there were any victims. And if anybody in Maricopa County knows that there were victims, and there were probably hundreds of victims in these cases, it's Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Now, I want to make one thing clear. There were about 400 bungled cases throughout the county. In El Mirage, there were, what, about 40 or 50 or so?
Correct.
You reviewed the cases. Is there one case in particular that stands out as particularly outrageous for not being investigated?
Yeah, in the book, I list over 30 of the cases and actually include the actual police reports in there so people can see just how serious these crimes were. But one example of a case that's in there involved a young girl, 13 or 14-year-old girl. She was mildly retarded. She was home alone while her mother was at work. A total stranger came to the door, knocked on the door, said he was having car trouble. The little girl let him in the house. He ended up sexually assaulting her, knocked her out. When her mother came home, she told her what happened. They called the sheriff's office. They came, took the initial report. It was turned over to detectives, but nothing ever came from that case.
And you detail several of those investigations in the book. You finish with that line over and over, nothing ever came of it. What explains to you why nothing ever came of so many of these cases?
And I think that's what all of us are still waiting for after 5 years when this was first reported, when we first notified the sheriff's office of this back in late 2007, when we told him that we uncovered all these cases that his guys had never worked. He said, well, I'm starting an internal investigation. Well, we're all still waiting for that to happen.
Correct. We still have not heard that internal investigation. He has promised it for many, many months. But as a cop, you know the way these organizations work.
Yeah.
You know the people involved. You know Dave Hendershot, Arpaio's former deputy. What do you think happened?
Well, we did look into it. When we uncovered this enormous level of neglect of all these cases, I just found it hard to believe that this was just some lazy detective who didn't do their job. We knew there had to be something more when you have these many cases. Well, what I learned was that the investigators who were in that unit, the sex crime unit, the special victims unit, that an organizational decision at the very top by Arpaio and his top aides was made to take manpower out of that unit to go conduct his politically motivated investigations, his smuggling unit, his immigration unit, his anti-corruption units, the ones he was doing these investigations on, his political enemies, the county attorneys, the county supervisors, the retired judges, the newspaper editors, those sorts of people. He was taking the manpower out of there, and he depleted the manpower out of that unit. The cases piled up, and when you leave only 3 or 4 detectives in a unit that size for an entire county, a county as big as Maricopa County, there's no way they can handle that many.
Has the sheriff threatened to retaliate against you for anything you've said over the last few years about this? Because this book is not the first time you've spoken out.
No, I haven't heard any specific retaliation or threats against the
subtle threats against you?
Well, we always feel that. And that's an interesting question, because every person that I have talked to about this book, cops, family members, everybody who's talked to me has said the same thing. They've asked me that same question. Do you fear retaliation from Arpaio about this book that you wrote? And my answer is always the same. What does that tell you? Even if he doesn't retaliate, there's this persona out there, this fear that if you exercise your free speech, that you have something to fear from the man. You know?
I did ask the sheriff for a response to your book. Here is what his spokesman said. Quote, "No one here has read it, received a copy of it, or intends to read it. Mr. Lewis was a political campaigner for the sheriff's one-time opponent, which speaks volumes as to his motivation for writing it." That was from Lisa Allen, the sheriff's spokeswoman. Your response to your political motivations for writing this?
There is no political motivation behind my book. I'm not running for office. I'm not looking for a job. I am enjoying life after 34 years in law enforcement. I wrote this book because it was in response to the sheriff's comment, and people have a right to know. I believe he tried to take the human element out of these cases. When he made that comment about if there really were any victims, I think that's what he's trying to do. I think he was trying to let people think that this was just some issue inside his organization and these weren't real people. My motivation is so people know these were real human beings with real lives, real problems, and they suffered as a result of this.
All right, Bill Lewis, the book is If There Were Any Victims. You can find it at iftherewereanyvictims.com and perhaps soon at your local bookstore. I know you're working on that. Bill Lewis, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Bram.